Welcome back to Reclining at Table with Jesus. We continue our series in Luke chapter 9, and in this episode we're going to look at verse 34 as Jesus on the Mount praying with Peter, James and John and Moses and Elijah. And it says in verse 34, as he was saying these things, that's Peter, a cloud came and overshadowed them, and they were afraid as they entered the cloud. And the cloud now in verse 35 is the presence of God the Father who speaks about Jesus. But we will look at that in another episode. But as we consider the prayer life of Jesus, often as we enter into the presence of God, we will have fear. Okay, because in verse 34 it says, as the cloud overshadowed them, they were afraid as they entered the cloud. So fear often comes among God's people as they enter into the presence of God. So don't be afraid of the fear. It's not a fear that drives you away from God. It's a fear that drives you to Him. It's one of honor and respect that we should have for Him. It's an awe in prayer. So that is one of the elements that will come in the prayer life as Jesus teaches us to pray, is that fear often will come across us as we come in to His presence. Notice two things about this fear, the people and the purpose. Firstly, the people, it says they were afraid as they entered the cloud. Who are they? Well, it's Peter, James and John, the disciples of Jesus. Even Peter, who is the chief apostle. When God's people come into His presence, there is fear. When non-Christians come into the presence of God, there is a fear. Felix, as Paul the apostle is sharing the gospel with him in Acts 24 verse 25, said he trembled. You will see it again in Jonah chapter 1 verse 16. The sailors throw Jonah overboard and it calms the sea, and it says they were terrified in verse 16. It is just a mark of God, but it's not just for non-believers when they enter the presence. It's God's own children. Okay, as we come into His presence, often the people of God, even the Peters and the Jameses and the John, are afraid as we come into His presence. So just biblically, remember Adam and Eve in Genesis chapter 3, as God came in the cool of the day. They hid in the trees because they were afraid. Abraham, chapter 15 of Genesis and verse 12, it says a great and terrible darkness came over him in a dream, and he was afraid. Moses, when he went up the mount to get the 10 Commandments, it says actually in Hebrews chapter 12, and I think it's verse 21, it says he trembled with fear. Okay, so right throughout the Bible, let me just give you possibly one more. And it's Acts chapter 5 and verse 11. After Ananias and Sapphira died in the presence of the church, it says fear came on all of the church, not some of the church, but there's an awe and a fear that God brings upon His people as we come into His presence. So whether we go into the closet individually or we go into the church corporately, when God draws near, often there is a godly fear that comes. So as Jesus teaches us to pray, we will often find ourselves being afraid. There is a fear with God. So what is the purpose of this fear? Well, there are a number of purposes to the fear of God. But by here, as I was looking at Luke chapter 9 and verse 34, I think the purpose is to silence Peter and the other two, but mainly Peter, because we saw how he is speaking in verse 33. And at the end of verse 33, it says he doesn't know what he's saying. Verse 34, as he was saying these things, but after the cloud comes and God the Father speaks in verse 35, listen to Jesus. That means, Peter, be quiet. And then in verse 36, it says, after the voice had spoken, they kept silent. So there is an element of prayer where we do speak, but there's an element of prayer where we need to learn to have a godly hush and silence. Don't we see that in the Bible? Okay, it's okay to be silent in the presence of God. Be still and know that I am God. That's Psalm 46 and verse 10. Revelations 8 verse 1. As Jesus unseals the last seal of the book, it says there was silence in heaven for 30 minutes, for half an hour. What about Elijah on Mount Carmel? He goes into the wilderness in 1 Kings 19 and verse 12. God wasn't in the fire or the earthquake or the wind, but God was in the still small voice. Actually, it says the sound of silence. God is in the silence. It's okay in prayer to be silent and listen. Okay, but the fear is to teach us to be silent, because Peter needs to be silent. That's why James chapter 1 verse 19 says, be quick to listen and slow to speak. Even Jesus knew there was a time not to speak in Isaiah 53, and I think it's verse 7, because he was a lamb that was led to the slaughter, and he did not open his mouth. So it's good to pray audibly and speak, but there's a time where we are still in God's presence and we acknowledge him as God. Yes, he is our Father. Yes, Jesus is our brother. Yes, the Holy Spirit is our comforter and help. But there's a time where we must realize whose presence we're in, the Almighty, and there is a hushed, godly silence. Not forever, but will teach us to be silent sometimes as we come into his presence. Let me just give you an example of this in Job. If you want to turn to Job with me, this is what I came across as I was pondering these verses. So Job is just before the book of Psalms. So Job, the end, he's gone, it's 42 chapters long, but in chapter 38, notice this sort of pattern, because sometimes we come into the presence of God and we speak and we need to be silent because we don't know what we're saying. And Job, this is what the Lord says to Job in chapter 38 verse 1. The Lord speaks from the whirlwind. Who is this, verse 2, that darkens my counsel with words without knowledge? Just reminded me of Peter. Who is this that darkens my counsel with words without knowledge? Other words, Job, be quiet. Dress for action, verse 3. And then the Lord goes, where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Where were you when the sons of God sang for joy? And then we just have this unfolding of God's majesty in creation. And we get then to chapter 40. And in verse 3, Job then answers the Lord and says, behold, I am of small account, in verse 4. What shall I answer you, Lord? I lay my hand upon my mouth. I lay my hand upon my mouth. Verse 5, I have spoken once. I have spoken twice. I will not answer or proceed any further. Job has learned to be quiet, because in verse 6 of chapter 40, the Lord will speak again from the whirlwind. Dress for action, man, because I'm going to question you now, because you're in the presence of the Almighty and you need to be silent. Job, where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Be silent in my presence. Do not be flippant in the presence of God. And then in chapter 42, Job does answer eventually. And he says, Lord, I know you can do all things. No plan of yours can be thwarted. I've heard in verse 5, I've heard of your hearing, but now my eyes have seen. But verse 3, therefore I have uttered what I did not understand. Things too wonderful for me, which I did not know. So Job and Peter need to learn, as they come into the presence of the Almighty in prayer, there is a time to be silent and just to know that the Lord is God. So in light of that, learn from Jesus when to speak, because it's good to speak, but when to be silent, and just enjoy the silence and listen to the Lord's voice to us in the whirlwind of the still small voice. So God's people often are afraid for the purpose for us to be silent, so that we can have ears to hear him and eyes to see him. So I pray that you would have some good silences this week as the Lord speaks to you. May the Lord bless you today. Amen.